Part 3, Rock Oil Rag. Chapter 16. Lou shifted the Blazer into gear and hit the gas. By the time he was back into third, the rain was coming down pretty hard. He grabbed a Marlboro from the pack in the cup holder and pulled the lighter out of its socket on the console. He held the orange-hot coil to the end of the cigarette and took a drag. When he offered the pack and the lighter to the girl, she accepted them wordlessly and lit up. Then, as an afterthought, Lou asked, "How old are you?"
18,
she said. "Okay," said Lou. A moment of silence.
16,
she said. "Okay," said Lou. "There's a code in the back seat if you want it." The girl found it and pulled it over herself like a blanket. There were a few more moments of silence as Lou navigated the wooded twists of 322, the rain sounding like a marching band against the roof of the vehicle. "So," said Lou, "probably none of my business, but I'm going to ask anyway. Are you sure I should be taking you to Twin Oaks Road? Not a hospital?"
"I think I'm okay,"
she said. Taking another puff of the cigarette, she checked the vanity mirror on the underside of the Blazer's sun visor and scraped some of the dried blood off her forehead with a fingernail.
"I was a little dizzy, but it's better now, and my arm's not as bad as it looks."
Lou glanced over at her and realized that she hadn't just been hugging her arms against the cold. She was currently lifting up his coat to examine her right arm, which had a large, bloody gash below the elbow. "You want to talk about it?" Lou asked. At this, the tears almost came on again, but at the last moment she managed to will herself to be angry instead.
"Got in an argument with my dad," she spat.
"Your dad?" said Lou. Another few moments of silence. "Again, probably none of my business," said Lou, "but no dad should hit his daughter. Ever." She turned away from him, propping her elbow against the door and shifting her head so as to hide her face behind a curtain of red-orange, stick-straight hair.
"He didn't hit me," she said flatly. "He threw me out of his car."
She smoked 2 more cigarettes over the next 5 miles. She said nothing, and neither did Lou. He wanted to say something, but nothing he could think to say sounded quite right, no matter how many times he tried to draft and reorder and revise his thoughts. He had never been very good with words, but the closer they got to their destination, the more the silence weighed on him. Finally, he had to ask, "This isn't your dad's place I'm taking you to, is it?"
"No," said the girl. "It's my grandma's."
"Will he come looking for you there?" asked Lou.
"Probably not for a while."
"I could take you to the police or something."
"No,"
was all she said. Lou shifted in his seat. "I'm Lou, by the way."
"I know,"
she said. Lou looked at her.
"I used to watch you play ball," she said.
She furrowed her brow and made a face as if he ought to know this.
"You played with my brother, Mike."
"Mike? You mean Mike Schultz?" Lou looked at the girl again, in a way seeing her for the first time. "Oh my God, Angie!" Her smile, the first of the drive, showed off 2 buck teeth and stretched out her freckles a bit, and some of the little girl he remembered shined through. "Angie Schultz," said Lou. "Of course, I'm sorry, I didn't even recognize you." Then quickly, to clarify, "You've really grown up."
"You picked me up and didn't even know who I was?"
she said, incredulous at the very idea.
"I thought you recognized me, and that was why you stopped."
Lou shrugged. "I just saw someone who needed a ride." Now the full truth of the girl's destination became clear. Twin Oaks Road. Amity Court. "I'm sorry," said Lou, and was not quite sure what he was apologizing for.
"It's okay,"
said Angie. Mike, never a great student but an exceptional athlete, had been the black sheep in the Schultz family. Although, come to think of it, maybe it was more like he was a white sheep in a family full of black ones. With the exception of Mike, every Schultz in Latonia City that Lou could think of had been a problem student at school, and a fair share had grown into problem citizens, and they all seemed to live at Amity Court on Twin Oaks Road. Lou did not look down on the Schultzes, or anyone else who lived at Amity Court. His father had come from poverty, and it had always been drilled into him to never look down on anyone. Nevertheless, Schultz was one of those names you were never surprised to see pop up in the Monday morning police blotter. Throwing one's daughter out of a car certainly fit the bill. Was the car moving when he threw her out? Lou wondered, but he didn't want to ask. Happy freaking Thanksgiving. Several minutes later, he turned onto Twin Oaks Road. How is Mike, anyway? Asked Lou. He's fine, said Angie. He's working at a garage out in Knox Corners. Got a big 12-point first day of archery. Nice, said Lou. He'd kill me for saying this, but ask him if he ever finally learned how to slide into third base. He'll know what it means. What? No, gross. Lou blinked. Huh? No. Oh, God, no. It's about baseball. Actual baseball. Oh, said Angie. Oh. Yeah, geez. Lou shook his head. See, we were playing Seneca Regional this one time. You might have even been there that day. And they had this real big guy who played third. He used to crowd the baseline whenever he covered the bag, and we all said if he tried that on us, we'd run him over. Just stupid talk, right? Guys being guys. Anyway, it's the first inning, and their pitcher's throwing garbage, and Mikey's on second. And I can see in the way he's hopping around, he's going to try to steal third. And he's got his eyes on that big third baseman. So, then he gets his chance, a called ball 4 in the dirt, and Mike takes off. As usual, the big guy's standing right in the baseline. Not even ready, not covering the bag, just standing in the baseline, right in Mikey's way. Well, I don't know if it was all our rough talk before the game or if Mikey just didn't like the look of the guy, but he doesn't even slow down. He lowers his shoulder and just plows right into the third baseman. Knocks the guy flat, but Mikey's going too fast. He trips and falls forward, lands right on his face, and goes rolling through the dirt. And when Mikey finally stops rolling, he stretches his arm out and smacks his hand down on the third base bag, as if he meant to do that, like the whole thing was a slide. So now there's this cloud of dust like somebody got in a fight in an old cartoon. Mikey's on the ground, the big guy from Seneca Regional's on the ground, and the whole field is silent. Our head coach is standing there in the box on the third base line, and Mikey just looks up at him with this big grin on his face, thinking Coach is about to tell him what a great job he did stealing third. And Coach says, "Schultz, you dumbass, there's a guy on first." Lou could see from Angie's polite smile that she wasn't quite getting the joke. See, it was a called ball 4, and Mikey was on second, said Lou. But he forgot that we had a guy right behind him on first, too. So the walk advanced both runners. He could have just walked to third. So he basically ran down this poor third baseman for no reason. Oh, said Angie. Oh! Yeah, said Lou. We gave him all sorts of hell for that one. Every game from then on, if Mikey got on second, you could bet your life that somebody was going to yell, "Slide into third, Mikey, slide!" Seneca Regional's third baseman hated him for the next 2 years, but he didn't stand on the baseline anymore. Next time I see him, I'm totally going to say that, said Angie. Do it, laughed Lou, and tell him McCullough says hi. I will, she said. He still talks about you sometimes. He said you still play ball. Yeah, at Pitt. How about Mikey? Angie said nothing for a second. The way she turned away and shook her head told Lou that had been the wrong question to ask. No, was all she said. Finally, Lou turned off of Twin Oaks and onto the dirt road that marked the entry of Amity Court. The rain had stopped, and before him, laid out in rows, was a grid system of mobile homes, each with its own driveway and little front yard. In the double lights of the blazers' headlamps, children's toys and pipe-framed swing sets cast shifting shadows on faux siding, cinder blocks, and empty brown bottles. Not every trailer court was rough, but in Seneca County, Amity Court was about as rough as it got. The third one on the right over there, said Angie, pointing. That pink one? Said Lou. Yeah. Angie's buck teeth were no longer showing, and Lou noticed that she was rubbing her arms again beneath his coat. You sure about this? Lou asked. I'm sure, said Angie. Lou kept driving, but much slower than necessary, because he was not so sure. But he couldn't rightly refuse either. He swung wide to avoid an overturned charcoal grill whose briquettes had been scattered across the lane. He almost kept driving past the pink trailer. Almost. But in the end, he slowed and put the vehicle in park. If she wasn't going to a hospital or a police station willingly, what else could he do? He turned and looked very seriously at the straight-haired girl with the freckles the girl he knew better as a tiny child in pigtails who was always in the stands for their home games, on her father's lap. "Angie, I will only let you out of this vehicle," said Lou, "if you promise me that this is a safe place for you to be tonight." Angie nodded. "It's safe." "I could take you to stay with your brother," said Lou, "or to my mom and dad's place, or the YWCA, or—" "It's safe," she said again. "I promise. My grandma's the only one home, and maybe her boyfriend, but he's nice to me." Lou hesitated. Then he reached into the back seat. He pushed aside the green duffel bag to get at his backpack, dug out a notebook and a pen, and jotted down 2 phone numbers. "The first number is my parents' house," he said. "I'll be there until Sunday night. The second number can reach me at school if you ever need to call me there for any reason." It was the number for the payphone in the hallway of his dorm at Pitt, which meant that at least in theory she could reach him there. But that would depend on whether A, someone bothered to pick up the ringing phone, B, the person who answered had any clue who Lou was, and C, they cared enough to go looking for him to tell him he had a call. Lou tore the sheet of college-ruled paper loose and handed it to Angie. "Even if all you need is a ride somewhere," said Lou, "or somewhere safe to be, call me." Angie stared at the piece of paper. "And Angie," said Lou, "if your old man ever lays a hand on you again—" Just thinking about it made Lou's fingers close tightly on the wheel of the Blazer, causing his forearms to bulge. "You find me and tell me," he said, "and whatever he does to you, I will do to him twice over." Angie's good eye went wide. "Oh, and tell Mikey to get a hold of me sometime," he added. "He can come down to Pitt for a weekend, and we'll catch up. Or maybe he could come and see me play ball sometime. I'm in his old position, second base." Angie hesitated. She looked down at the paper again. "What if I call the house and your dad answers?" Lou sighed. "Don't believe everything you hear about my dad. He's a good guy, really." "Okay," said Angie, removing his coat from her lap. "Thank you, Lou." Lou nodded, and with that, Angie climbed out of the passenger side. Lou waited until she'd made it indoors, hoping he hadn't made a terrible mistake by bringing her here. A few seconds later, as he pulled out onto the dirt drive, the Blazer's headlamps shifted, shining their full glow on a small sign on wire posts in the front yard of the pink trailer. It read, "Save our hospitals." Lou frowned at it. Then he hit the gas. Chapter 17. There had always been something strange about that X on the wall. Lou wasn't sure what it was that bothered him about it exactly. Maybe just the fact that it was so off-centered, his father, ever a practical and meticulous man, had drawn it on the wall when Lou was a small boy as a target for him to practice throwing his baseball and catching it when it bounced back, in the winter months when it was too cold to go outside. But for some reason, Nat had drawn it in an odd spot on the wall. It was pretty high, really, to serve as a good throwing target. And placing it in an off-center spot was nothing like Nathaniel G. McCulloch, who contended there was a right way to do everything, and tended to strive for it on every occasion. Even in something as inconsequential as drawing an X on the wall, Lou would have expected Nat to have placed it dead center and at the optimal height. Lou hauled back and gave the ball a throw. Not a baseball. Heck, a baseball would have knocked this crummy old house down. Instead, he used a blue rubber racquetball, which had been his standard weapon of choice for basement-bound fielding practice since the age of 12. It was better practice than one might have thought. Racquetballs were a bit small, but they had a hell of a bounce and took funny hops that kept you on your toes. When it came off the wall along the seam of one of the bricks, it could produce an unexpected backspin. Good training for hand-eye coordination and reaction time. As the ball took a hop and came back into Lou's open glove, he paused to look around the nasty dirt floor basement. He would never understand why his father had stayed in this old house all these years. He'd had major renovations done, but Lord knew Nathaniel McCulloch had enough money to afford a better place than this. Sure, the man had grown up here, but at some point a guy had to cut his own cord and move on. Lou was about to toss the ball again when a high-pitched wail came reverberating through the floorboards above his head. "God help me," Lou muttered under his breath.
Miles frickin' Davis at it again?
He rolled into the driveway in his blazer late the previous night, and he had, thus far, managed to avoid the sound of Nat blowing his horn, but his luck only lasted so long.
Hope Angie's all right, thought Lou. I should have insisted on taking her to the hospital to get checked out. Who knows if she was telling the whole story? He made a mental note to keep an eye on the police blotter anytime he was in town in the future, and to pray that he never saw the name Angie Schultz in it. He tossed the ball a few more times before the sound of his father's trumpet became too much for him. Finally, he shoved the racquetball into his glove, pulled the glove off his hand, and tossed it into the corner of the basement. The trumpet, no, cornet, his father always insisted on calling it, only got louder as Lou climbed the stairs. He emerged on the first floor of the house, ignored his father in the adjoining room with his horn raised to his lips, and walked down the hall to his bedroom. Lou shut the door behind him and within seconds had his record player rotating. He cranked the knob until Eddie Van Halen's guitar was drowning out Nat McCulloch's cornet. If there was one thing Lou had not missed since leaving for college last year, it was listening to his father play the same old songs every night, badly. At least this time he would only have to put up with it for a couple of days until Thanksgiving break was over. I've got to find some other place to stay after next semester, thought Lou, throwing himself down onto his bed. I cannot take another whole summer of this. I just can't. Got to get out of here. Lou's grandfather had built this house, and his father had lived in it for almost his entire life. He could have bought something bigger, in a nicer neighborhood, but he'd instead chosen to have the old place restored, renovated, and added on to. So the little house that had been practically a shack during Nat's boyhood was transformed into a beautiful middle-class home with respectable square footage and an enviable view of the river across the railroad tracks, though no trains ran on them anymore. Nat often spoke of one day handing the family home down to Lou. Me? Live in this house? Thought Lou. Over my dead body. Lou wasn't surprised when he heard the quiet knock from his door, barely audible over the wail of Eddie's guitar. Come in, Lou called without turning down the volume or moving from his bed. The door opened a few inches and his mother ducked her head in. Her blonde hair was done up high and tightly curled. An unlit cigarette was pinched between fingers with long, bright red nails. Rose Stewart McCulloch said something that Lou didn't hear, then waited for a response. She did not raise her voice or strain herself in order to be heard over the sound of the record. On principle, she never raised her voice, which forced Lou to get up off his bed and turn the music down. What? He said. I said, is everything okay in here? She said, same volume as before. Yeah, why? Said Lou. Well, said Rose, just because you've been gone for a while doesn't mean I've forgotten what you're like when you're upset. Her lipstick matched the red of her fingernails, as did her heels. Lou had barely ever seen her without makeup on, and he did not think he had ever seen her wear anything other than a dress outside of the house. She leaned against the door frame and crossed her arms, nodding toward Lou's Panasonic turntable. When you turn the volume on that thing so high that even you don't enjoy the sound of it anymore, it means something's up. Lou blinked. This behavior was news to him, but thinking about it, she was right. I like the hairdo, by the way, she added, grinning. I bet Dad doesn't, said Lou. No, he does not, said Rose. So, what's wrong? I don't know, said Lou. Rose gave him a moment to think. He needed that sometimes, to collect his thoughts. Yeah, he concluded. I don't know. Is it maybe a little strange to come home again? She asked. After being independent and on your own for a while? A particularly high note from Nat McCulloch's cornet came through loud and clear from down the hall, and Lou felt his jaw clench involuntarily. How could a person practice all his life at something and still be so bad at it? It is a little strange, he agreed. Well, I understand that, but you also have to remember, said Rose in the sing-song sort of cadence she always used when making a very good point. Neither of us got the opportunity to go to college. Rose waited. From experience, Lou knew that she would not continue until he acknowledged what she had said. It was a sort of conversational tic she had. She was a sixth-grade teacher by trade, and there were times when her techniques for dealing with rowdy students permeated into her parenting style, never mind that her son was almost 20 years old. "I know," said Lou. "And this arrangement is just as new to us as it is to you," she continued. She waited again. "I understand," Lou said, nodding. "So if we're not acting the way you think we're supposed to be acting, just know that we can't read your mind, but we are trying. It's a challenge to reconcile the fact that you are an independent person now, but also still our child, and still living under our roof, and subject to our rules. We will do our best to respect your independence, if you will also do your best to respect us." The rules in question were the ones that had to do with the 2 six-packs Lou had brought home in the back seat of his Blazer. He'd stashed them in his baseball bag before bringing his things into the house, but he had expected to make it longer than a day before getting caught with them. Leave it to his teetotaling father to bring the hammer down over a couple of beers. There were times when Lou thought the apple could not have fallen farther from the tree. The kind of words people used to describe Nat McCulloch were gentle, kind, and upright. But Lou McCulloch was competitive and not very gentle. Nat was kind to everyone he met, but Lou could be mean, and he knew it, especially if someone didn't deserve kindness. Woe to them. And upright? Well, as a kid, Lou had been known to sneak cigarettes and curse rather creatively when adults weren't listening. He was upright in the ways that mattered to him, but outside of that, there was fun to be had. From what Lou could tell, he was more like his grandfather Grant than his dad. Lou had been told that Grant McCulloch had once fist-fought a union boss on the factory floor of the Germania Oil Well Supply Company over a labor dispute. Meanwhile, the only thing even remotely scandalous that Lou had ever heard of his father doing came from a story told by one of Nat's childhood friends, Art Hart, owner of the local music store, in which Art claimed that he and Nat had once snuck into the Derrick Theater without tickets. But Art Hart was well known as a peddler of tall tales, and it sure didn't sound like something Lou's father would do. "I do respect your rules," Lou told Rose. "I wasn't going to drink in the house. There's supposed to be a party in town tomorrow night, so I was going to take them there." "We don't want you drinking there either," said Rose. "Imagine how it would look if you were picked up." Imagine how it would look, thought Lou. Not imagine what would happen, not imagine how it would affect you. No, imagine how it would look. "Dad has always said, 'No drinking in this house,'" said Lou. "I wasn't going to drink in this house. I was going to take it somewhere else. I was following his rules." Rose slipped the unlit cigarette behind her ear. Lou had left his own smokes in the Blazer. He wasn't even going to try to anticipate his father's rules regarding cigarettes in the house. For as long as he could remember, his father had smoked a pipe in the den every evening after dinner. But his mother, who smoked cigarettes, only ever smoked them outside. Lou wasn't sure if this was an unspoken rule, an official policy, or something in between. But he had a feeling that if he broached the subject, it would only lead to further disagreements, so he decided to let it be for now. It wasn't worth the effort. Only now did Rose step all the way into Lou's bedroom. She glanced back over her shoulder, then shut the door behind her. "It's not so much the drinking itself," she said, lowering her voice a bit. "It's more, well, honestly, it's really just about listening to your father right now." Rose McCulloch sat down on the bed beside Lou, which was something she hadn't done in a long time. "You haven't been home in a while," she said, "so you wouldn't know, but things have gotten much worse." "What has?" said Lou. "You mean the hospital thing?" "Yes, that." Rose pulled the cigarette back out from behind her ear and rolled it nervously between her fingers. "It's not just the talk radio call-ins or the town hall meetings anymore. There have been letters and phone calls." Lou leaned over to switch off the record player. It was Van Halen's newest album,
released just a few months prior, and this was one of Lou's least favorite tracks on it anyway. A strange cover of an old-timey song from the 1920s. "Well, what do you mean?" said Lou. "Like threats?" Rose sucked her teeth. Mostly just minor harassing sorts of comments, but yes, there have also been some threats." "Mom," said Lou, sitting up very straight. "If anyone has threatened you, I will—" "No, you most certainly will not. Bite your tongue right now, and don't you say another word. Lord, that's all we need. You getting into a fight or mixed up in some sort of trouble. This whole hospital situation has gotten out of control. The doctors in this town have the people so riled up." Lou's mother trailed off, and Lou realized why. His father's trumpet playing from the opposite side of the house had stopped. "I'm not asking you to be enthused about being home," Rose whispered. "I'm not even asking you to be nice. All I ask is that you don't put your father under any more stress than he already is. Please. His doctor said—" "Honey," came Nat's voice from the hall outside. "I'm in here talking to Louis, dear," Rose called. "I'll be right out." Lou's mother gave his knee a little squeeze. "Can you do that, Louis?" she whispered. "Just for a few days." Louis. No one had called him that in months. But Lou nodded. Rose winked at him, then she left the room. Lou remained seated on the bed. Don't put your father under any stress. Well, he would try, but his success would all depend on whether he managed to intercept a certain letter from the university in time. If it hasn't gotten here already, that is. In the hallway outside, Lou's father spoke softly. No doubt he thought he was speaking quietly enough so as not to be heard through the door, but his hearing wasn't so good these days and he spoke louder than he knew. "Is he going to straighten up?" asked Nat. Lou bristled. "We talked it over and everything is fine," Rose replied. "Good," said Nat. "So what do you think? A little rusty, but do I still got it?" "Still got it," said Rose. "You sound just like Gid the Great." Chapter 18. Latonia City, Pennsylvania, July 1939. "Maybe he couldn't get away," said Dick. "Maybe Poppy wouldn't let him." A few quiet seconds passed. "We did say right here, didn't we?" said Dick. Another few seconds. "We said right here, right? Didn't we?" "Yes, okay, yes," said Nat. "We said right here, and yes, he is late. What do you want me to do about it?" "I don't know," Dick snapped back. "Sorry, okay?" Nat chewed on his lip thoughtfully, looking up East First Street and then down. For what felt like the 100th time, a passerby lugging shopping bags forced him and Dick to retreat a bit further back on the sidewalk. They now had their backs flat against the stone of the St. Stephen's Cathedral, which stood like an impenetrable medieval bastion amid the city's shoulder-to-shoulder shop buildings and tenements. Nat had only been in downtown Latonia at night a few times before, and those times had been with his parents. It was almost 8 now, and the sun had just dipped below the buildings across the road on Central Avenue. Before long, it would be night, well and truly night, and Nat was out on his own. Such a thing had never happened before. As he and Dick stood on the corner of East First Street and Warren Street, 1 block from the derrick, he found himself surprised by how lit up the streets already were. Not a single storefront was dark. There were people everywhere, with sidewalks so choked that on his way here, he'd had difficulty navigating through the throng at the center of town. The streets were lined with parked vehicles, and the traffic came in steady, alternating streams. Cars, trucks, buses. He'd never seen the city quite like this before. And up until about 15 minutes ago, the pulsing epicenter of the commotion had been the Derrick Theater, whose facade was illuminated by a bank of searchlights shining up on it from below. A mob of people had been waiting outside the theater, men in suits and hats, women in furs. There had been ticket takers at the doors, and young men parking cars and a few shabby-looking kids hanging around. And there had been police officers watching the crowd. Nat had even seen one of the aforementioned shabby-looking kids caught while trying to reach into a theater-goer's pocket, only to be grabbed by a cop and pulled away by his ear. To where? The paddy wagon? Nat didn't know. But now the doors of the derrick were shut, and the only people in front of the theater were the usual pedestrians, plus a pair of city cops chatting with one another as they paced in front of the doors, looking for all the world like a couple of troops outside an army fort. He is there right now, thought Nat. Get the great Gideon Rust. The show's probably already started, and I'm missing it. Even if Art does show up, I don't see how we're going to get in, said Dick, whose voice was taking on an increasingly whiny quality with each passing minute. He had to talk around, a white and red swirled peppermint in his mouth. He'd been carrying around a bag of them for the past few days, but was down to his last few. I mean, it wasn't like this when we took a look the other day. Course it wasn't, said Nat. We knew it wouldn't be. It doesn't change the plan. A middle-aged woman carrying a paper shopping bag slowed down in front of Nat and Dick. Nat did his best to look uninteresting and stepped in front of his pack on the ground, the one he'd carried here all the way from Sylvan Row but had set on the sidewalk because it was so heavy, and subtly pushed it behind him a few inches. The woman did a double-take. She watched the two of them, two young boys just standing there alone on the busy sidewalk. For a moment, it looked as if she might say something. Then she sniffed, seemed to decide the whole thing was none of her business, and kept walking. With his hands behind his back, Nat drummed his fingers against the stone of the cathedral and shifted his weight nervously from one foot to the other. What time you got now? He asked. 1 minute after the last time you asked, Dick said. Don't get lippy with me, said Nat, just because you're scared. It's 10 minutes after 8, said Dick, and I'm not scared. I'm just tired of being asked what time it is. Then give me your watch. Get your own. Nat grumbled a word under his breath that he'd learned from an older kid at school. I say we give him a couple more minutes, then go, with or without him. Okay, said Dick, looking at his watch again. What do you mean by a couple, though? 2. That's what a couple is. Not always. Yes, it is. Look it up in the dictionary. People say a couple all the time when they mean more than 2. Well, when I say it, it always means 2. At 8:12, a couple of minutes from now, we'll... Nat trailed off. His attention was drawn toward the sudden pat-pat-pat that anyone who is a child or has ever been a child can identify as the sound of another child's worn-down shoes smacking heavy-footed against the ground as they run. He turned toward the sound and saw a pair of shoppers parting just in time to make way for a rail-thin youth with wispy hair to come sprinting up the sidewalk. Panting, Art Hart came to a skidding halt in front of Nat and Dick. Where on earth have you been? Demanded Dick. We said 8:15. And although it could not have been a single minute since the last time he had checked his wristwatch, he consulted it again. It's going on 1/4. Sorry, said Art. You could have gone in without me. I'd have caught up. Now he tells us, said Dick. He bit down, cracking the peppermint sweet between his teeth. The shop was busy, Art said. Poppy wouldn't let me go until it had slowed down a bit. And it still hasn't slowed. I snuck out. He giggled and shook his head. Boy, am I going to catch hell for this. Good man, said Nat. All right, we're all here now, so let's go. Without waiting for a response from the others, without even waiting to see if they would follow, Nat hurried down the street toward the crosswalk. Chapter 19. Latonia City, Pennsylvania, November 1982. This place, thought Lou. This fricking place. Who needs one? Right here, said Lou. The can of Budweiser sailed through the dugout, and Lou caught it with an outstretched hand. The source of the lob, the ample-framed Eddie Tarr, followed it up by tossing him the opener. Lou caught that too, then neatly punched the top of the can. Then it was bottoms up as Eddie, Bill Mayle, and Deb McClintock watched. Out of the 4 of them, Lou was the only one who had left town for college. He was a sophomore now, and they were all quite impressed with how his drinking had progressed. He lowered the empty can and wiped his mouth. All the colleges in the area had let out for Thanksgiving break, which meant that everyone was in town for a few days. Naturally, there would be a big party tomorrow. Everyone would be there. As for tonight, one of Lou's old buddies had gotten a hold of him to tell him to come over to the football field, where a bunch of guys were getting together. Lou had been a three-sport athlete all through high school, and seeing the old football crew might have been nice. But had any of those guys tried to keep in touch with him since he'd left? Had any of them called him or returned his calls? Eddie, Bill, and Deb, on the other hand. They returned his calls and called him once in a while, too, to see how he was holding up in the city. He would have rather spent a Friday night with any one of them over the whole football team. Especially Deb. She'd always shot him down in high school. But, well, it could have been his imagination, but she seemed to be looking at him differently now. The old baseball dugout wasn't glamorous, just a freestanding brick structure with a caged-in front that made one feel like a chicken in a coop. But, coopish as it might have been, it was just as good a place to sit and throw back a few as it was to take shelter in during a rain delay. Lou stared through the wire fence out onto the diamond. The dirt infield was even crummier than he remembered. At the university, they had a grass infield that got mowed before every game, and so far, his dad hadn't seen him play on it once. "I don't get it," said Lou. "Why are people so bent out of shape about this hospital thing?" "I guess I don't really know either," admitted Bill. "Never really heard the full story." "You see the signs yet?" asked Eddie. Lou nodded. "I saw a few as I rolled into town yesterday. The one in the front yard in Amity Court had been the first, but there were plenty of others. Not just posted in front yards, but hung in shop windows, taped to telephone poles, tacked to fences, and stuck to the bumpers of cars. Signs and stickers that read, "Save our hospitals." "Do you not know the full story, Lou?" asked Deb. "Yeah, doesn't your old man talk about it?" said Eddie. "He and I haven't really talked much since I left for school," said Lou. "I mean, I know what's going on. It's people's reaction I don't understand. He doesn't like to talk about it." "I'm not surprised," said Eddie. "People hate him." Bill nudged Eddie with his elbow. "What? I don't," Eddie clarified. "A lot of people also agree with your dad," said Deb. "Maybe even most people, but the ones who don't are being stirred up and your dad's the scapegoat." Lou reclined on the bench and let the back of his head rest against the cool brick of the dugout wall. He was used to having his family's reputation precede him, but usually it was in a good way. Until recently, Lou had never heard a bad word spoken about Nat McCullough. It was always, "You're Nat's boy. Old Nat is one of the good ones." Or, "Oh, you're Rose Stewart's kid. Didn't she marry little Nat McCullough? A good guy, Nat." All the stories he'd ever heard about his father were the good kind. Stories like how when Nat was a boy, he would give his sack lunch to a child from one of the poor families who sometimes showed up to school with nothing to eat. Never mind that the McCulloughs were just as poor. The difference was, when there wasn't enough food in the McCullough house, it was the parents who went hungry while the kids ate. Stories like how, after Nat's father, Lou's grandpa, had died young, Nat had gone to work to help support the family, tending the register at Poppy Hart's Music Emporium and doing tune-ups and pumping gas at the local service station. And he never complained about it, even when it stretched him thin during the school year and amounted to practically a full-time work schedule in the summer. There had been no sports or clubs for Nat McCullough. His after-school activities had been providing for the family, which consisted of him, his mother, and his 5 sisters. That sort of workload wasn't technically legal for a minor to take on, but it had all been done under the table, and the family would have been bad off otherwise. Stories of how Nat had worked hard in school with the hopes of someday putting himself through college. How he'd gone to work at the Germania oil well supply company like his father before him when college had proven too expensive. And how, by saving up money on the side for years, he'd eventually scraped together enough to go to business school. After business school, Germania had rehired Nat, this time to keep their books. Somewhere in there, he'd enlisted in the Navy. Lou was a little fuzzy on the timeline, but he knew that after the Navy, Nat had been hired at the Latonia National Bank. Lou also knew that it was through a connection at the bank that he'd eventually taken his position as director of the Latonia City Chamber of Commerce. The chamber was one of many local organizations in which Nat McCullough played a role. He was on so many boards and a member of so many committees that Lou had never been able to keep track of them all. But it was there, at the chamber, that the trouble had started. "Pass me another one," said Lou. Eddie did, and Lou punched it open and threw it back. When it was gone, he placed the empty on the dugout bench beside him and stared down at his feet. "Not a drop of alcohol has ever touched these lips," Nat McCulloch was known to boast. "Not once in my life." Yeah, the apple certainly had fallen a long way from the tree, that was for damn sure. Lou hadn't been a straight-A student. He suspected that he was capable of such a thing. Maybe. But he'd always felt that the sort of hard work that studying required was best reserved for wind sprints, layup drills, and batting practice. He had also developed an interest in landscape paintings, but his father was about as interested in art as he was in sports. Growing up with a good family reputation, Lou thought, was in some ways even more impressive than living under a bad one. He sometimes envied a person like Mikey Schultz, because an anomaly from a ne'er-do-well brood was praised when he rose above the standard, but coming from good stock ensured that even minor childish infractions didn't go unnoticed. Boys like Lou were told things like, "I know you were brought up better than that," and "What would your father say?" Still, Lou was just being impudent, and he knew it. When he thought of Angie over at Amity Court, he knew which option he would have preferred. The trouble was that he just felt so pinned in. Nat and Rose had always had a plan for him. He was their only son, and he was going to college. He would get a degree, and then he would get the kind of job that opened up the sorts of doors that had always been locked tight to kids like Nat and Rose. And he had been content to go along with this plan, so long as he could play sports while he did it. That was how he had come to begin a 4-year bachelor's program in business administration at the University of Pittsburgh, where he'd managed to secure a walk-on spot on the baseball team his freshman year. By the 3rd week in the season, he'd been starting at second base and batting cleanup, and maintaining a low B average. This semester, he was set to pass all his classes again without any issues. To Nat and Rose's knowledge, this academic arrangement would continue as planned, and they would keep believing that, as long as Lou managed to intercept a certain letter. He checked the mailbox that morning and again that afternoon, but it hadn't been there. "It all started civil enough," said Deb, pausing to open a can of her own. "Just some opinion pieces in the paper, then some town hall meetings, and then, I don't know, it got ugly." Lou sighed, thinking back to his mother's talk of harassing phone calls and threats at home. "The whole thing will blow over eventually," Bill said cheerfully. "I don't know," said Eddie. "My dad said every time he goes in for an appointment, the doctors are talking their patients' ears off about it, telling them how if the city hospital closes, the doctors will all lose their jobs and the people will lose access to their health care and have to travel out of this county." "That is not true," said Deb. "Rumors like that are the problem. The doctors think they're going to lose their jobs, so they've turned it into a smear campaign to try to discredit Mr. McCulloch. And that Bauman woman is the worst of the lot. The things she writes, trying to rile people up. It's shameful. I heard a rumor that Nat's taking bribes from some corporation in Pittsburgh slated to build the new place once the old hospitals close," said Eddie. Lou turned on him. "That's a damn lie." I know, Eddie said, hands raised defensively. "But that's what they're saying." "Eddie, that's probably enough," said Bill. "All I meant is that I heard it." "My dad isn't perfect," said Lou, "but making this town better is all he's ever cared about. I sometimes think he cares more about that than he cares about me. He isn't taking any bribes, and anybody who says he is will answer to me." "You're going to have to be careful this summer then," said Eddie. "You think I'm afraid?" demanded Lou. "Nah, man, that's not it," said Eddie. "I just mean, well, you're going to have to fight a lot of people if that's how you feel about it, and it probably wouldn't help your dad's case anyway. Did he say if he's going to resign?" "Resign?" said Lou. "From the chamber?" "That's their latest thing," said Bill. "People are calling for him to resign as director." "Yup," Eddie chimed in.
Because of the scandal.
Eddie, cool it, said Bill.
Scandal? Said Lou. Since when is it a scandal? He's done nothing wrong.
I don't know,
said Eddie. But a bunch of business owners signed a petition, and the ones that didn't sign, well, people are boycotting their stores now.
Eddie, for the last time, would you cram it already?
Said Bill.
What?
Eddie protested.
He didn't know. I know, said Bill. But that's enough, okay?
Lou hauled back and pitched his empty. It rattled against the fence.
This frickin' place,
he thought again.
You know, I was always told to stay away from the McCullochs, Deb said playfully, breaking the silence.
Me too,
Eddie cut in.
Because of the curse, because of what happened to old Grant and...
Eddie, seriously, Bill said. What, I can't say anything? Said Eddie.
No, not because of a stupid superstition, said Deb.
I was told to stay away from the McCulloch family because they were bad news.
Lou grinned.
Really?
Really, said Deb McClintock.
Something about a dispute over a fishing license? But even my dad knows that a bad word said against Nat McCulloch's character is a lie.
Deb was sitting with her shoes together and her elbows in her lap, holding her Budweiser on top of her knees. Lou smiled at her. She smiled back at him. Chapter 20.
Oh, son of a bitch,
Lou said, plenty loud for it to be heard all the way on the parallel fairway. He had just watched his ball go slicing through the air like the off-kilter flight of a cheap boomerang, ending with a resounding crack as it struck an unseen tree trunk along the woodline. Lou stared for a moment, hopeful, but the ball did not bounce out.
Damn it,
he swore again. He looked across the fairway. The November sky was cloudless and it was unseasonably warm. So warm that any golf enthusiast with the day off or otherwise had flocked to the nearest course to capitalize on it. And beneath that cloudless sky stood his father, a good deal closer to the green, with an iron propped over his shoulder as he waited for Lou. Nat McCulloch was a man of average height. He wore a fedora when he golfed to shield his eyes from the sun, in addition to the shaded horn-rimmed glasses that he always wore. These dark lenses had become quite fashionable. His shoulders had been strong and squared once, but now were rounded and a bit slouched. He wore a blue button-up shirt and shorts, and his legs were skinny and pale. His face was cleanly shaven, and his hands were free of calluses. And at his midsection was a belly that one might have easily mistaken for a pillow stuffed under his shirt. It was, in not so many words, the quintessential white-collar body. He watched Lou for a moment, then slowly shook his head. Lou could practically hear the disapproving sigh from here, which was about as close as his father got to obscenities. In fact, as far as Lou could remember, he had never heard the man swear in his entire life. Nat lined up his shot, then took a slow, graceful swing. The path of his ball was like a rainbow. It landed in the center of the green, bounced, and stopped. Lou grumbled under his breath, slung his bag over his shoulder, and started walking toward the woodline. He knew he shouldn't have sworn so loudly like that, but it was a bad shot. What was he supposed to do? Be happy about it? It had been Rose's suggestion that the two McCulloch men take advantage of the day to share a round of golf. Doubtless, she intended the outing to be an icebreaker and to help reduce the stress constantly weighing on Nat as the result of the hospital situation, which was less a situation than it was a snowball that had careened downhill and grown in strength until it destroyed or knocked loose everything it touched, until the snowball itself was indistinguishable from the avalanche it had caused. Lou didn't know all the details, but he knew that trouble had been brewing since at least the 1960s. The gist of things was that the two major medical centers in the area, a pair of hospitals in Latonia City and Cornplanter, were both going broke. Some blamed the declining populations in the two cities, a direct result, Nat's father was always quick to point out, of the devastating loss of industry across the once highly productive oil region. He always used the word devastating when he referred to the loss of industry. It wasn't that the wells had gone dry. There was still oil in the ground. The problem was that it was less financially feasible to reach the reserves here than it was to reach them elsewhere. It was a numbers game, pure and simple.
It had been cheaper for the locally grown oil giants to move their operations to places where one needn't drill so deep. So they had left. And the pumping of Pennsylvania crude out of the valley that changed the world had all but ceased. The once busy refineries and foundries and factories associated with that industry now sat empty. And the resulting loss of employment had spurred a mass population exodus from little towns like Latonia City. By some estimates, within 20 years, half of all Latonians had left for greener pastures. There was no enterprise that did not suffer as a result of the drop in population, including the healthcare industry. It hadn't taken long for the Latonia City Medical Center and the Pennswood Hospital and Corn Planter, each of which had been built to support much larger communities, to feel the impact. Lou stopped beside the wood line, dropped a fresh ball at the approximate location where his first one had left the fairway, and pulled out his 7-iron. Golf was the only sport Nat had ever shown any interest in, but Lou was of the mind that any sport that could be played by old men was hardly worth playing at all. Or maybe he was just too impatient to care to get any good at it. He lined up his shot, hauled back, and swung with all his might. He always swung with all his might. How else should a man swing? The ball did not sail nicely upward the way it was supposed to. Instead, it traveled like a bottle rocket fired horizontally. After about 75 yards, it hit the fairway, skipped hard, bounced, and rolled up to sit beside the green. One of his best shots all day. On the opposite side of the green, Nat sat on a small bench beside a wire wastepaper basket and a ball washing machine, waiting patiently. Lou slid his club back into his bag and headed toward his ball. Many potential solutions had been brainstormed in an attempt to solve the Seneca County healthcare crisis, 2 large hospitals both hemorrhaging cash. In the 1970s, a division of labor deal had been struck between the 2 facilities. Instead of a full range of services offered at each hospital, certain services took place exclusively at one of the 2. It was a less than ideal solution, but it was what the people got. The Pennswood Hospital in Corn Planter lost its maternity department and cancer center, and Latonia City Medical Center lost, among other things, a dedicated emergency ward. To many, the loss of the emergency ward had seemed outrageous, but a full impact study had determined that Pennswood Hospital was within sufficient proximity of the main population of Latonia City, meaning that its location was suitable to service both communities. Nevertheless, the whole arrangement didn't sit right with a lot of people, including Nat G. McCullough, whose father Grant had died in the back of an ambulance. He perhaps, more than anyone, knew the importance of having access to high-quality and prompt medical care. As the newly appointed director of the Chamber of Commerce at the time, Nat McCulloch was a pillar of the community. Lou thought pillar of the community was a stupid term, but there it was. And it was no surprise when he accepted a chair on a newly formed board whose purpose was to facilitate the collaboration between Latonia City Medical Center and Pennswood Hospital. It was a surprise when Nat and a few of his contemporaries spearheaded an altogether new initiative, a proposal to replace the 2 outdated hospitals with a new state-of-the-art facility built in a more central location. This would provide easier, fairer access to health care, not just for residents of Latonia City and Corn Planter, but for some of the smaller surrounding towns throughout the county as well. And that was where it had all gone wrong. The new initiative was quickly met with fierce and vocal opposition from a group that was as influential in the community as it was well-funded, the medical professionals who worked at the 2 hospitals. Keenly aware of the loss of jobs that would follow if such a merger took place, an inevitability in a county where jobs were disappearing for everybody, not just healthcare workers, this group felt threatened, and they started a movement of their own. The Save Our Hospitals Coalition was an initiative aimed to preserving the old medical centers. At first, they attempted to refute the numbers, claiming that a new medical center would prove more expensive for the county and detrimental to its citizens. But the data did not support their position. So when that didn't work, they targeted the individuals at the heart of the matter, first simply attempting to discredit them, then implying that the persons in question had something to gain personally from the arrangement, that they were lining their own pockets instead of doing what was in the residents' best interests. A daringly ironic premise, and there was perhaps no individual more at the heart of this matter than the director of the Chamber of Commerce and the chair of the merger committee, Nat McCulloch, who soon became the object of their ire. In a way, they could not have picked a more difficult target. Nat was well liked, and his background was squeaky clean. Not a drop of alcohol has ever touched these lips, lest we forget. But things got nasty as time wore on, and the opposition found ways to make their claims stick. As it now stood, it looked like the initiative for the hospital merger and the construction of a new medical facility would indeed pass. But the Save Our Hospitals coalition hadn't given up yet. They were still fighting, and they were fighting dirty. Misinformation, rumors about bribes from big Pittsburgh corporations, boycotts of area businesses, harassing phone calls, and words like scandal printed in the newspaper by staff writers like May Bauman, who discriminating readers might have done well to note was married to one Dr. Bauman of Cornplanter. Things had gotten so bad that the chief of the Latonia City Police Department had urged Nat to stay far away from any more town hall meetings, as authorities had reason to believe that his life might be in danger. The petition calling for Nat to resign from the chamber had been news to Lou. He'd wanted to ask him about that today, but so far it just hadn't seemed like the right time. His father seemed upset with him. He always seemed upset with him. It was like there was a veil between them. Nat had the gift of gab. He was a social butterfly right at home in the middle of a conversation, but Lou had not inherited that gift. This, in addition to their personal differences, made Lou one of the few people with whom Nat did not easily converse. Lou had always found this idea difficult to accept. Lou stepped up to his ball and pulled his 9-iron from his bag. All the while, Nat watched him from the bench, arms crossed, waiting for his son to catch up with him. "I hate golf," thought Lou, and swung hard. Chapter 21. Latonia City, Pennsylvania, December 2019. Despite the strong assertion he had made during his argument with his father, Owen McCullough did not quit his job. In fact, he continued to work faithfully at the paper for weeks that turned into months. Before he knew it, it was December of 2019, and he had been working at the Oildham Morning Herald for almost 5 months. He still did not know why the name was hyphenated, and he very much doubted that he ever would. But he had witnessed his daughter taking her wobbly first steps and saying her first words, and he and Kayla had signed the papers to take over Ruth Lee's mortgage, and they had moved out of the little rented house with its neighbors within arm's reach and into Ruth Lee's country home. And, hoping to smooth over some of the rough patches that had been brought on by his daily 6 to midnight schedule, Owen had bought his wife a puppy, a Welsh corgi named Bandit. He knew it was shameless, but in marriage sometimes one had to score points however one could. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Owen had just woken up to prepare for work. Kayla was still at work, and Ruth Lee was watching Emma while Owen slept. This was their standard daily schedule. But as he emerged from the bedroom that he and Kayla shared at the back of his mother-in-law's house, the place was quiet. A lot had happened in the past few months, but there was one thing that had not happened. Owen hadn't once spoken with his father. Not a word had been exchanged between them since their argument on the golf course, not even on the day that he and Kayla had moved out of their tiny rented house and into Ruth Lee's place. Owen's mother had come over, bringing a housewarming gift of freshly baked cookies, apologizing and explaining that Owen's father had been busy that day. Such a long-lasting fight was unprecedented in the McCulloch family. Owen went to the kitchen, poured himself a cup of coffee from Ruth Lee's ancient-looking coffee maker, then went into the dining room to look out the bay window where 2 cactus plants and a flowering peace plant grew in pots on the sill. There, the reason for the house's silence became clear. It was a sunny, warmer than usual day for early December, and Ruth Lee was taking advantage of it. Emma, as usual, was strapped into the small pink plastic swing in the tree, and her head tilted to the side, asleep. Under the swing, Bandit the corgi puppy and a mostly beagle named Wilma lay in the grass. Ruth Lee was on her knees nearby, holding a can of WD-40 in one hand and an old rag in the other, tending to a rusty, child-sized bike. "What the?" said Owen. He squinted and realized that Ruth Lee was tending to the same bike that Kayla had discovered on the front porch of the little rented house on 322, months ago, before the move.
the one that one of the neighbor kids had left there. Owen took another sip of coffee, tossed on a light jacket, and stepped outside. Immediately, Ruth Lee looked up. Even in her late 70s, her ears were still good enough to hear a screen door turning on well-greased hinges. Bandit and Wilma were slower on the uptake. Owen had taken a few steps before the dogs rushed over to greet him. He got down on his knees, petting them both, playfully rolling Bandit over and ruffling the fur behind his long, perked-up ears. He still had those sharp puppy teeth, but he never bit hard. "You get enough sleep?" asked Ruth Lee. The volume of her voice, high-pitched and sweet at most times but capable of sharpness when necessary, indicated that she was not concerned with Emma waking up. "You bet," said Owen. Still engaged in a one-handed wrestling match with Bandit, he gestured with his coffee cup. "Where did you find that bike?" "Have you been looking for it?" asked Ruth Lee. She started to push herself up off the ground and didn't manage it the first time. Owen moved forward to help her, but by the time he got there, she'd done it on her own steam. "No," answered Owen. "It's not even ours." She made a face. "Not yours?" "No," said Owen. "How did it get here?" "Uh-oh," said Ruth Lee. Then she slapped a hand to her head, blew a raspberry, and erupted in a peal of laughter that excited Bandit enough to make him jump and yip. "Oh, my. I've had this in the garage since Yuns moved in here. It was on your porch when you were moving. I thought it was yours, so I tossed it in that trailer and brought it over here. Put it in the back of the garage and forgot about it." A flash of something crossed Ruth Lee's face. The look she made when she remembered something that made her shift topics in mid-thought, which she tended to do a lot. "Oh, did you want me to make you something for dinner since Kayla's working late tonight?" "She's working late?" said Owen. "Busy day, apparently. She didn't text you." Owen shook his head. It had been several days since he'd received one of the midday texts that Kayla always used to send him during her lunch hour, just to let him know how her day was going. Sometimes it felt like they barely saw each other anymore. And when they did, it was either after a long, hard shift or as one of them was rushing to prepare for the next one. Weekends were usually spent recovering from the week and arguing over little things. Kayla's job was stressful and took its toll on her every day, and Owen knew that his schedule at the paper only added to her overall stress. He wanted to fix it, to save her from it, but he didn't know how. The distance between them was growing. He wouldn't have said they were fighting necessarily, but they seemed to be constantly getting the worst of one another. "I wonder if she's left work yet," said Ruth Lee. "Let's find out." And she pulled the cell phone from her pocket. Owen resisted the urge to roll his eyes. It had taken Ruth Lee several years to fully embrace the idea of carrying a cell phone, but boy, had she embraced it. Owen thought that the ability to track someone's location using their phone was a bit much, even a little creepy. But Ruth Lee loved it. "Nope," said Ruth Lee after a few harder-than-necessary taps on her phone's screen. "Still at work." She pinched her fingers on the screen to zoom in. "And in the north wing of the facility, looks like." "Good to know," said Owen. Ruth Lee put her phone away and slapped the handlebars of the bike, laughing at herself all over again. "Well, guess I'd better take this old thing back over and ask your old neighbors if anybody's been looking for it. I was wondering why you bought Emma a bike in such rough shape, but I thought maybe it was a hand-me-down." The possibility gave Owen pause. He looked hard at the bike. Its surfaces were coated in rust with faded yellow paint on the body. The rubber grips on the handlebars were suffering from dry rot. The spokes were brown with jagged surfaces, and the tires were as flat as tires can be. Leaning forward, he saw that there was a piece of foam between the handlebars. A thin strip of fabric clung to the foam that read, in flaming, extreme-looking font that was badly faded, "Too cool for words." And beneath it, hanging from a dirty old plastic zip tie, was a keychain that read, "Seneca County Fish Hatchery, Kearsburg, PA." And just like that, the penny dropped. Suddenly, Owen could see the extreme-looking font not so faded, the tires not so flat. The yellow paint, he realized, only looked yellow because it had been bleached by long days or years beneath the sun. It had been green once, a bright electric shade of green. He could feel himself riding
remembered how, when you first started out, the gearless little rig's tires would spin in place and throw up gravel behind you before the treads could find enough purchase to propel you forward. And that zip tie. He remembered taking it from a tiny storage container of plastic drawers on his father's workbench and using it to attach that keychain he'd gotten as a souvenir from his Cub Scout troop's visit to the fish hatchery. Why he had wanted it so prominently displayed, he could only imagine. But he had done it. He had. "This is my bike," Owen said, then repeated, "This is my bike." "I won't tell if you won't," said Ruth Lee. "I doubt anybody will come looking for it after all this time. A bit of a lemon anyway, if you ask me." "No, I mean, it's mine," said Owen. "Jeez, this was my bike when I was a kid." He stepped forward and touched the dry, rotted rubber of the handlebars. One memory gave way to another. He could see the wrapping paper coming off of it on Christmas morning. It hadn't really been wrapped, per se, so much as draped in paper with a bow stuck on top. He couldn't have been older than 5 or 6 years old at the time. The obvious question was how, 20-some years later, it had found its way onto his back porch. The just as obvious answer was that his father or mother had brought it over and left it there. And the fact that not a word had been said about it pointed to his father. "He brought my old bike over," thought Owen, "and left it without saying a word." The sheer absurdity of it struck Owen, and he shook his head in frustration. "Ruth Lee," he said, "I do not understand my father." "I imagine," said Ruth Lee, "that you aren't the first young man to feel that way, but it might help if you spoke with him." Owen grimaced. Ruth Lee Hart Woodford was not a woman known to pull her punches, and he had walked right into that one. "How long has it been?" she asked. "I haven't heard from him in 4 or 5 months. He's acting like a child. He didn't even call or text when we moved out of the old house." "So that means you can't call or text?" said Ruth Lee. "Or go over and visit?" "Well, if he doesn't want me to," Owen began, but he didn't finish. "He doesn't have the only say in the matter," said Ruth Lee. "You only get one father, and if he was gone tomorrow, it wouldn't be his fault you hadn't talked." Owen said nothing. "Someone once said," Ruth Lee went on, "that a man ought to forgive his brother 70 times 7 times. I imagine the same applies to a father. Your dad lost the right to be a boy, to act like a child, to use your words, the day his father died. So if he's acting like a child now, maybe there's something else going on you don't know about. Maybe, just this once. He needs you to be the man in the relationship for him." Ruth Lee brushed her hands off on her pants. "Well, I'm heading in to get a drink," she said. "Can I get you anything?" Owen felt that he could barely speak. "No, thank you," he managed after a few seconds. His mother-in-law headed toward the screen door. As she pulled it open, she turned toward the dogs. "You coming?" she asked. Wilma the beagle lumbered after her. Her comma-shaped tail wagged back and forth, slapping hard against the doorframe as she entered the house. But Bandit remained sitting at Owen's feet, looking expectantly up at him. Owen got down on his knees and scratched the top of Bandit's head. A thought occurred to him, and he rolled up the sleeve of his jacket to look at his left elbow. There was a small semicircle of white in the skin on his funny bone, a scar he'd gotten from riding the bike in front of him too fast down a gravel driveway as a boy. He'd forgotten all about it, but now he could remember everything, right down to what the weather had been like that day. He remembered how the front tire had twisted between 2 larger-than-usual chunks of gravel, causing him to pitch forward. How he'd landed and looked down to see a piece of skin missing, which had frightened him more than it had hurt. He remembered the smell of the freshly cut grass, and the shirt his dad had been wearing when he'd come to lift him up and carry him to the house for a Band-Aid and an orange push-pop. Chapter 22. An hour later, light snow was falling, and Owen was just stepping out of the front door when he saw Kayla pulling into the driveway. She parked in the driveway and for a moment just sat there in the car. He waited, but she didn't get out. He walked toward the car. When she saw him coming, she opened the door, but even before he said hello, he noticed her body language. Rapid blinking, clenched jaw, red nose. She'd been crying. "Are you okay?" said Owen. "Fine," Kayla said. She wore baby blue scrubs and her long dark hair was done up in a tight bun. She wouldn't look at him but tried to step past him toward the house. "Kayla," said Owen, "what's wrong?" "Nothing," she said, "just a bad day at work." "Did something happen?" said Owen. "Nothing, really," Kayla said, glancing at the time on her phone. "Don't you need to get going?" Owen looked at his phone, too. He did need to get going. When he looked back up, she was biting her lip, clearly trying not to start crying again. "Kayla," said Owen, touching her on the shoulder. "Are you okay?" She made an exasperated noise in her throat. "What do you want me to say? Yes?" Owen felt his forehead pinch as he tried to restrain his annoyance. "I just want to know what's wrong." "Well, I'd be happy to tell you, but 30 seconds in the driveway isn't going to cut it." "Fine. Sorry for trying." If his goal had been to get her attention, that one had done it. Now she was looking at him. "So I'm not trying?" said Kayla. "Just because I don't want to talk when you're ready to talk, it means I'm not trying?" "I didn't realize I needed to make an appointment," said Owen. The annoyance he had managed to hold back up until now broke through, loud and clear. "Next time, I won't bother." Kayla stared at him for a moment, then turned away. She rubbed her hands against her shoulders, shivering against the cold. Owen shut his eyes, already regretting his words and hating himself for not keeping his cool. When Kayla turned back to him, she was wiping away fresh tears. "I just had a bad day, that's all," she said. "I'm sorry," Owen said, and he meant it. "I didn't mean to. I'm just sorry, that's all." "I know," said Kayla. "We will get through this," said Owen. She nodded, but not in a way that said she believed him. "I'm cold," she said, and she started toward the house. "Have a good day at work." "We will get through this," Owen said again, this time to her back, and thought, "We will, won't we?" Standing alone in the snow, he watched the door of the house swing shut behind her. Chapter 23. When something bothered Owen McCullough, his response was usually to do everything in his power to avoid thinking about it at all costs. So, as he sat in his red Ford Focus, waiting at the same red light he got stuck at almost every day on his way to work, he was trying not to think about Kayla. But the more he tried not to think about her, the more he thought about her, and the tears in her eyes, and the way her jaw always clenched when she'd been crying. And the more he thought about all that, the more he hated himself for taking a bad day and making it even worse for her, and the more he worried about their future. He looked up through the driving snow at the marvelous facade of the Derrick Theater. At this time of year, it was nearly dark by 5 o'clock in the evening, and the snow made the visibility far worse. But he had practically memorized the features on the front of that grand old building, given that he had so many chances to stop and look at it every day. And now that it looked like the theater would indeed be torn down this summer, he paid even closer attention. Owen detested the idea. Demolishing a defunct parking garage was one thing, but this was the Derrick. He hoped that someone would at least have the courtesy to chisel off and preserve the carved theatrical masks on the building's heights before they destroyed the place. It would be strange to look up and not see those empty stone eye sockets gazing back down at him, or that lone, gnarled tree that grew inconceivably from the corner of the roof. When the light turned green, Owen proceeded through the town, his wipers swiping slowly at the snow accumulating on the windshield. As much as he hated the change, it wasn't surprising given Latonia City's depressed, blighted status. Back in the late 1800s, Pennsylvania crude had been some of the highest quality oil to be found anywhere on Earth, and nowhere was it more prevalent than it had been here. Hence the region's nickname, the Valley that Changed the World. But the real story was what this had done to the region's people. In a strange bit of serendipity, drilling rights had made many a lucky landholder into a millionaire, and even after the industry had dried up and left town, Trust funds managed at the Latonia National Bank had kept the local economy afloat for a time. But with no fresh influx of commercial enterprise, the city had slid into a decline, and it was still falling. Dave White, the ginger cat-loving photographer at the paper, had turned out to be a man of strong convictions and many, many theories, not all of which would have been wise to share in polite company. And for some reason, he seemed to enjoy sharing them with Owen any chance he got. Dave White had, on multiple occasions, condemned the local rich boys who were the sons and daughters of farmers lucky enough to have owned oil-soaked ground, and content to live off their family money and enjoy the ride while it lasted. Owen didn't know about all that, but he couldn't deny that Latonia City seemed cursed to never escape the shadow of its former glory, and Owen knew a thing or two about curses. Though the snow slowed him down a bit, he still arrived at the Oildom News-Herald with a few minutes to spare before his shift started. Not long enough to dally, but long enough to quickly say hello to Felicia at the front desk as she was packing up to leave, and ask if her kids were excited for Christmas. "Excited?" was her response. "You have no idea. Just wait until yours is old enough." Owen smiled at the thought. "Have they been to the mall to see Santa yet?" "Yes, and now they want to go back a second time," she said as she slipped a hat over her head, careful not to muss her long silver-purple hair. "I swear, we do all this work, and then we give the guy in the red all the credit. I have no idea why we do this to ourselves. By next year, Emma will be old enough that you'll get to join in the fun." "I can't wait," said Owen, and he meant it. "Well, good luck tonight," said Felicia. "This place has been nuts today. I still don't get why you came back to work in our rinky-dink newspaper." She had meant it to be funny, and normally Owen would have favored her with a polite, light-hearted response. But today, all he could muster was a sigh and a, "Yeah, me neither." Felicia winced. "That came out wrong. I didn't mean that to be, negative or anything." "It's okay," said Owen. He hesitated. There was a part of him that did want to explain the decision to her, to tell her about how the demands of his old job, constantly traveling and spending 5 nights a week in hotel rooms, had nearly destroyed his marriage. How, as much as he'd enjoyed the work, he had left that position to save his relationship with Kayla and spend more time with her. How, as hesitant as he'd been to move back to his hometown, he'd done it to provide Emma with a good place to grow up, and so he could be closer and have a better relationship with his parents. Those were the reasons why he had come back, but he didn't have the heart to articulate this, considering the irony that he was presently failing on almost all of these fronts. The conflicts must have shown on his face, because Felicia stepped around her desk and placed a hand on his shoulder, rubbing it softly. "Hang in there," she said. "I'm trying," Owen said. As Felicia exited through the front doors, Owen proceeded into the back, where he turned the corner and nearly ran straight into May Bauman. "Sorry," he muttered. "No, my fault," she said sweetly, smiling up at him. "Is Felicia still out there?" "She was just leaving as I came in." May pursed her lips. "Shoot, I was going to have her fax something." Owen might have offered to do it for her, if it had been anyone but May, a woman who had not so long ago run an article that had incensed him to the point that he'd considered quitting. "Sorry," he said. "You just missed her." After all, she knew perfectly well how to fax something. "Oh, well, it can wait until tomorrow," said May. "She's a sweet girl, really. It's always nice to see someone like that doing well, even overlooking her lifestyle choices. In a town like this, it's not easy to come from a family with a reputation." She paused and looked up at Owen as if realizing she'd just said something rude. She put a hand to her sternum and said, "Oh dear, no offense, of course." Owen, who had not taken any until now, gave May his thinnest smile. "Don't mention it." "Have a nice night," she said in a sing-song voice as she brushed past him. By the time Owen got to his desk, the few extra minutes he'd had going for him were gone, and he was officially late signing in at his workstation. He had barely finished hitting the enter key, confirming his clock-in time, when the door to Dave Albaugh's office opened. Dave stepped out. As ever, there was a moment when he looked legitimately lost. Then he scanned the room with his wire-framed glasses, spotted Owen, and seemed to be found again. "Owen," he said, "come over here a minute." And he stepped back into his office. Owen gave his clock-in time a second look. 2 minutes late. He had never been late before, not once. But late was late. One might have expected Dave Albaugh's office to have matched the man, a nucleus of chaos and disorganization threatening to spill out and contaminate everyone and everything around it. Instead, the room was neat and tidy. Owen put it down to the fact that it was almost empty. Dave seemed to keep no mementos, no photos, no extraneous supplies that could have cluttered his desk. In short, his office was clean because there was so little in it to mess it up. It wasn't a bad strategy. Dave sat at his desk, looking down at his computer screen with that look that anybody over a certain age looks at a computer screen, his eyes squinting suspiciously, his nose pointing slightly up in the air, a look on his face as if he'd just smelled a fart. Owen knocked at the doorframe. "Owen," Dave said, looking up. "We were just talking about you. May and I mean." "You were?" Owen said, expecting the worst. "She was telling me," said Dave, "that she thinks you have a tendency to rewrite as opposed to edit, and that got me thinking. May is talking about retiring soon." "No kidding," said Owen, making a mental note to celebrate privately later. "Good for her." "Yeah, well, I don't know what soon means to her. Could be a month, could be a year, but she's been here forever, and she's thinking about leaving. I've got to be thinking about hiring a replacement. In my head, that meant a replacement for her. But maybe instead of rewriting, you'd like to try your hand at doing the writing yourself." For a moment, Owen had nothing to say. "Well, that would... I've never really thought about it before." "Is that something you'd be interested in?" "I'd be willing to give it a shot." "As far as I'm concerned, you've proven you know your stuff," said Dave. "I know my plan for a dedicated copy desk didn't work out quite as I'd planned, but you rolled with the punches and were patient about the whole thing." He lowered his voice and leaned forward over his desk. "And frankly, May's not the only staff writer who's getting up there in years. Their time is passing, and I just think we're wasting your talent on ad space and proofreading. Depending on how it goes, I may just move you into writing full-time. The pay's better. It's a salaried position. Plus, the hours are friendlier for a family man. 10 to 6 instead of 6 to midnight." Owen was usually good at hiding his feelings, but this time he couldn't hold back a smile. A normal schedule. Time with the family. And what if he started making enough for Kayla to quit her job and find some less stressful work? Something that paid a little less, perhaps, but didn't give her so many bad days and make her cry alone in the car on her way home. "How do we make this happen?" asked Owen. "What do you need from me?" "Well, it's not a sure thing just yet," said Dave. "But now that I know you're interested, I'll see what I can do. Until then, do me a favor and keep this between you and me. Deal?" Owen extended a hand across the desk. "Thank you, Dave," he said. "This means a lot." Dave grabbed Owen's hand and pumped it, then stood and gave him a friendly slap on the shoulder. "You deserve it. For now, better get to work, Mr. Archaeologist. Got a long night ahead of us." "Yes, sir," said Owen. Chapter 24. Latonia City, Pennsylvania, July 1939. Scouting the area the day before had proven to be a prudent venture, as the sun was way down by now, and the alley behind the Derrick Theater looked a lot different in the dark. Nat went first, leaving the sidewalk to move quietly into the alleyway. There he crouched in the shadows at the corner of the building. No sign of anyone guarding the back of the building, no one between him and his destination, a freight entrance at the back of the theater. Hart Sounds, in addition to doing the standard business of a music emporium and record shop, also rented out gear, instruments and microphones and such, to some of the music acts that toured the Northeast and the Great Lakes. Over the years, Poppy Hart's brother, Art's uncle,
had delivered last-minute items to the derrick as minor as an emergency set of banjo strings and as substantial as a full drum kit. And on a few of those deliveries, young Art had accompanied him to do a bit of the lifting. That was how he had known about the freight entrance. "All clear," said Nat, adjusting the weight of the pack slung over his shoulder. Art left the light of the street lamp, trying to look casual at first. Then he ducked low and hurried to join Nat in the shadows. Dick came next, looking a bit more conspicuous while hiking up his ill-fitting short pants to hustle over. "Nobody watching the door," Dick whispered as he arrived beside them, grinning like Harpo Marx. Art held a finger to his lips and shot Dick a serious look. "There could be somebody on the other side, though. Cops or security. We should only talk if it's urgent." Dick nodded to acknowledge the warning, although he apparently found it urgent enough to turn to Nat and ask, "You got it, right?" Nat lowered the pack from his shoulder and opened it. Inside, hidden beneath tomorrow's set of clothes and a Dick Tracy comic, added for good measure, just in case his mother happened to look inside, was a length of rope arranged in meticulously wrapped coils. He had found it in his father's storage shed. It was quite sturdy and had, more than likely, walked off the job at the Germania Oil Well Supply Company by hitching a ride home in Grant McCulloch's lunchbox. Nat estimated that it would be plenty long enough to get the job done tonight. Tied to the end of the rope was an old cotton flour sack. His mother always kept them for reuse purposes, not just as containers, but sometimes to patch clothing. Nat felt guilty about borrowing the flour sack, more guilty than he suspected his father had ever felt about the various items that occasionally found their way home from Germania in his lunchbox. He would do his best to give the flour sack back, but he would have to clean and wash it first because it was currently about half filled with sand. Sand he had scavenged from the laid-bare shallows of the drought-low Allegheny River across the tracks from his house. While Art watched the door and Dick kept an eye on the street behind them, Nat uncoiled the rope. One end was loose. The opposite end was tied the best he knew how to the flour sack of sand. During their pre-heist scouting mission, when it had become clear that getting in through the door of the freight entrance would be impossible, it had been proposed they might somehow climb up to the second or third floor. Ultimately, the boys had decided, Art in particular had been the herald of reason in this regard, that scaling a vertical building side was a feat best left to Dick Tracy and his contemporaries. And then Nat had noticed the fire escape. It was a clever little contraption. Most of the fire escapes in town were of the kind that looked like exterior metal walkways with little ladders at the bottom, inaccessible from the street below, able to slide down from above in the event of an emergency. But this one was different. Instead of a ladder, the bottom of the fire escape was like an additional set of steps, held aloft by what appeared to be a counterweight, like a great teeter-totter balanced on a fulcrum in the middle. When someone from above descended, the stairs would extend downward automatically by way of the escapee's body weight. How much weight was required to make the rig move, Nat didn't know. And whether or not some sort of lever or safety mechanism had to be engaged from above before the stairs could be lowered, he also didn't know. These two variables would ultimately determine whether or not his plan would work. Nat could feel his heartbeat in his fingertips. He drew a long breath in through his nostrils and tried to ignore how even his insides seemed to be shaking. This was it. They weren't searching for treasure on the riverbanks anymore. "All right," he whispered to his co-conspirators. "Watch my back and snap your fingers if anybody's coming." Art and Dick nodded. Nat approached the back entrance to the derrick building with his rope and sandbag invention in hand. He stood, looking up at the bottom of the fire escape. "Here goes nothing," he thought. Doing his best impression of the Lone Ranger, he held the loose end of the length of rope in his offhand and grabbed it near the flour sack with the other, gripping it like a lasso. He had practiced in his backyard a few times, but in the heat of the moment he was having trouble remembering how he'd done it. He tested the weight, trying to relocate the optimal hand position. He moved his arm in a loop to swing the flour sack, first back and forth, then in a full swing. He did 3 full circles, building up momentum with each swing, until finally he heaved with all his might and let the flour sack fly upward. It sailed in an arc toward the fire escape. But the thing was too heavy, and his throw didn't have enough height. The length of rope unspooled through his loosely gripped hand as the flour sack went up, 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 fell short of its mark, and came down, down, down. It hit the ground in the alley with a muffled thump. Nat shot Dick a look, thinking about how much noise he'd have just made if they'd gone with his first suggestion, a wrench. Easier to throw, maybe, but that wouldn't matter if they alerted the whole block. He retrieved the flour sack from the ground, undid his knot, and opened up the top of the bag. He tipped it to the side to allow some of the sand to fall out onto the ground. Then he tested the weight of the bag, tied it shut again. A snap of fingers in the dark. Nat turned and saw that Art had one hand raised, pointing back toward the street where they'd come from, the direction Dick was supposed to be watching. There, parked alongside the curb, was a police cruiser. In the light of the street lamp, the vehicle's weight shifted on its shocks, and a pot-bellied officer of the law exited the driver's side. The man stepped up onto the sidewalk, took out his flashlight, and started walking toward the darkened alley.